On the morning of the 1st of April, 1945, 182,821 American assault troops came ashore on the Higuchi beaches of Okinawa, and almost nobody shot at them. This is the story of what that silence cost. 82 days later, the same operation had produced close to 50,000 American casualties, somewhere between 66,000 and 110,000 Japanese military dead, and a civilian death toll that historians still cannot agree on, with estimates running from 42,000 at the low end to 150,000 at the high end, on an island whose entire population numbered under 500,000. That landing went unopposed because it was supposed to. That is the first thing most accounts of Okinawa get backwards. The Japanese 32nd Army did not fail to defend the beaches, and instead chose not to defend the beaches deliberately, as a matter of doctrine, after a strategic reassessment that ranks among the coldest and most rational decisions any Japanese commander reached in the entire Pacific War. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima watched from the high ground at Shuri as roughly 16,000 American troops came ashore in the space of a single hour, and Ushijima did nothing, because doing nothing was the plan. Okinawa became the largest and bloodiest amphibious campaign of the Pacific War. Okinawa also stands as the only prefecture of sovereign Japanese home territory to experience ground combat. Those two facts are not separate ones. They are the same fact, and the collision between them produced a catastrophe that Japan has spent 80 years arguing about in its courtrooms, its classrooms, and its textbook screening committees. Americans called the Operation Iceberg. Okinawans called what happened to them the Typhoon of Steel. To understand why Okinawa produced a civilian death toll that nobody can pin down, you have to understand what Okinawa was in 1945 and what it had been before that. Okinawa is the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, a chain running southwest from the Japanese home islands toward Taiwan, sitting roughly 350 miles, or 563 kilometers, south of Kyushu. On a map of the Pacific War, Okinawa is the last stepping stone. On a map of the Japanese Empire, Okinawa is something more complicated, a periphery that had been swallowed relatively recently and never entirely digested. The Ryukyu Islands were not historically Japanese. The Ryukyu Kingdom operated as an independent polity with its own monarchy, its own diplomatic relationships, and its own languages. In 1879, in an act Japanese history calls the Ryukyu Disposition, the Meiji government abolished that kingdom outright and reconstituted the territory as Okinawa Prefecture. Count the years, and that lands 66 years before the American landing, which meant there were Okinawans alive in 1945 whose grandparents had been subjects of a king rather than an emperor. What followed annexation was a policy of assimilation that ran on the assumption that Okinawans were Japanese in an incomplete and provisional sense. Ryukyuan languages were suppressed in favor of Standard Japanese. Okinawans occupied a subordinate rung in the Japanese ethno-national hierarchy, not foreign, not colonized the way Korea and Taiwan were formally colonized, but not fully equal either. Something in between, a prefecture on paper and a periphery in practice. Hold that detail, because it turns lethal later. When Japanese soldiers from the home islands were garrisoned on Okinawa, and began hearing civilians speak a language those soldiers could not understand, some of them concluded they were listening to spies. Okinawan civilians died at the hands of the Japanese army on suspicion of espionage during the battle. Suppressing the Okinawan language and killing Okinawan civilians as suspected spies amount to the same policy, 66 years apart, arriving at its logical conclusion. By 1945, roughly 490,000 civilians remained on the island, and that figure is what was left after approximately 80,000 had already been evacuated. Pre-war population estimates for Okinawa generally run between 450,000 and 490,000. Whichever figure you take, the arithmetic that follows turns brutal. Britannica puts Okinawan civilian deaths at least 100,000, and History Hit frames the same estimate differently, as many as 100,000, roughly 1/4 of the pre-war population, 1 in 4, and that is the low to middle estimate rather than the high one. The American reason for taking Okinawa was never Okinawa. The American reason for taking Okinawa was Japan. By early 1945, Allied planning had converged on Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, which came in two phases. Operation Olympic would strike Kyushu, the southernmost home island, in November 1945, and Operation Coronet would follow against Honshu and the Tokyo Plain in 1946. Nothing on that scale had ever been attempted, and Downfall would have dwarfed Normandy. An operation that size demands a forward base, and Okinawa stood as the only candidate that worked. 350 miles from Kyushu placed Okinawa inside fighter range of the Japanese home islands. Kadena and Yontan airfields already existed there, and American forces would seize both within hours of the landing. Okinawa offered anchorage for a fleet, ground for troop staging, and space for the enormous logistical apparatus an invasion of Japan would require. American planners assigned the operation a set of code names that tell you how they were thinking. The overall operation went by Iceberg. The Ryukyus as a region were bunkhouse. Okinawa itself carried the code name Scattering, and Iwo Jima, taken earlier that same year, had been detachment. The scale of what was moved to support Iceberg resists conveying in tonnage, so consider it comparatively. Iceberg consumed roughly twice the material of the entire Marianas campaign and roughly 3 times that of Iwo Jima. Supplies landed for the assault alone came to 746,850 measurement tons, or 286,635 short tons, according to the ammunition and supply tables in the United States Army official history compiled by Appleman, Burns, Googler, and Stevens. This is the part of amphibious warfare that nobody films. The bottleneck in an operation like Iceberg is almost never courage and almost never firepower. The bottleneck is throughput, meaning how much material can be moved across an unimproved beach per hour, sustained, for weeks on end. It belongs to the same class of problem that governs modern port congestion and container throughput, where the constraint is not how much cargo exists, but how fast the interface between ship and shore can process it. Every division that lands adds demand to that interface. The American plan for Okinawa was, in engineering terms, a throughput problem dressed as a battle, and that constraint would later shape one of the most contested command decisions of the campaign. More than 1,300 ships took part. The initial assault and first echelon garrison lift alone required 458 ships carrying 193,852 troops. 10th Army itself comprised roughly 102,000 Army personnel, roughly 88,000 Marines, and roughly 18,000 Navy personnel, coming to approximately 208,000 in total. Against that stood the Japanese 32nd Army, and the size of the 32nd Army is where the arithmetic starts getting slippery, in a way that recurs for the rest of this story. The single most important Japanese unit at the Battle of Okinawa was a division that was not at the Battle of Okinawa. 32nd Army was originally built around 3 divisions, the 9th, the 24th, and the 62nd, and the 9th was the best of them. The Army University Press assessment describes the 9th as the most capable and experienced division in the 32nd Army. Japanese defensive planning for Okinawa had been constructed around what that division could do. In late 1944, Imperial General Headquarters looked at the map and reached a judgment about where the Americans would strike next. Tokyo guessed Taiwan. Acting on that guess, 10th Area Army withdrew the 9th Division from Okinawa and shipped it to Formosa. Imperial General Headquarters intended to send a replacement, and the replacement never arrived. By that point in the war, Japanese shipping losses had climbed to a level where moving a division across water no longer counted as a routine administrative act, and had become a gamble against American submarines and American aircraft that Tokyo increasingly declined to take. 32nd Army had requested 180,000 troops for the defense of Okinawa, and received nothing to replace what had been taken away. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the senior operations officer of the 32nd Army, later described what that loss did to Japanese planning. The original scheme had been a beach defense plan, with the 9th Division repulsing the American landing at the water's edge, meeting the invasion where it was weakest, in the surf and on the sand, before the beachhead could consolidate. That is orthodox doctrine. That is what the Japanese had attempted, with catastrophic results, at Saipan and elsewhere. Take the 9th Division out of that equation and beach defense becomes arithmetic that does not close. Yahara knew it. What the 32nd Army did next is something almost no Japanese command had done up to that point in the Pacific War, which was to abandon the doctrine outright. American historians have noted the consequences of the transfer with something close to relief. Richard Frank's assessment of the 9th Division's removal to Taiwan describes it as very fortunately for the Americans, and that judgment holds as far as it goes, since a fully manned 32nd Army would have posed a harder proposition. There is a contrarian reading here that deserves airing, and it runs the opposite way. Removing the 9th Division did not merely weaken the Japanese defense of Okinawa. Removing the 9th Division forced the Japanese defense of Okinawa to become far more dangerous than it would otherwise have been. Deprived of the option to fight the battle the way doctrine said to fight it, Ushijima and Yahara were pushed into designing a battle no Japanese commander had yet designed, and that battle, the one they actually fought, inflicted proportionally heavier losses on the United States than any Japanese beach defense ever had. Tokyo's error handed the Americans a weaker garrison and, at the same time, a smarter one. Those are not the same thing, and the second turned out to matter more. The plan Colonel Hiromichi Yahara built for Okinawa carried the name Jikuzen, meaning attritional defense, protracted warfare, and the thing to understand about Jikuzen at Okinawa is that it was never designed to win. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this campaign, and it gets routinely lost. Yahara was not trying to defeat the American invasion, because Yahara had run the arithmetic and knew the invasion could not be defeated. What Yahara was trying to do was make the invasion expensive enough and slow enough that the cost of taking Okinawa would register in Washington as a preview of the cost of taking Japan itself. 32nd Army responded by ceding the beaches, ceded the airfields, and ceded the northern two-thirds of the island almost without a fight. Ushijima and Yahara instead concentrated the Japanese defense in the south, along a fortified belt anchored on the line running Naha to Shuri to Yanabaru. Into the limestone ridges of that belt went a network of interconnected caves, tunnels, reverse slope positions, and mutually supporting firing points that had been under construction for months, and Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, Ushijima's chief of staff, masterminded much of the Shuri fortification work. What Yahara constructed was, in modern terms, an asymmetric cost exchange system. The logic matches the logic that governs contemporary defensive cybersecurity. A defender who cannot prevent intrusion can still win by inverting the economics of that intrusion, by ensuring every meter of progress the attacker makes costs disproportionately more than it costs the defender to contest it. You do not need to stop the attacker. You need to make the attacker's cost curve steeper than the attacker's tolerance for cost. That is Yahara's entire design, rendered in coral limestone rather than code. The design worked. The United States Naval Institute, writing in 2016, characterized Ushijima's campaign as one of the few campaigns in the last 3 years of the war marked by astute Japanese generalship. The Army University Press staff ride study goes further, judging that the new commitment of the 32nd Army to attrition warfare in the south of the island was probably more important than any other event in making the performance of the Imperial Japanese Army on Okinawa, along with that on Iwo Jima, the most militarily effective of the Pacific War. Read that assessment carefully, because it comes from an American institution, concerns a Japanese command, and leaves no ambiguity. Okinawa was the best-run defensive battle the Imperial Japanese Army fought. Now hold that judgment against the second one, equally defensible, pointing the other way. Yahara's plan guaranteed the annihilation of the 32nd Army. Nobody disputes this, and Yahara did not dispute it. That plan also did something else, something the operational literature covers far less. By concentrating the final battle in the southern third of Okinawa, Yahara concentrated the final battle in the most densely populated third of Okinawa. The Naha to Shuri to Yanabaru line was not empty ground. That is where the people lived. Every day the 32nd Army successfully extended the battle was another day of American naval gunfire, aerial bombardment, and artillery falling on terrain saturated with civilians who had nowhere to go. The strategy that made the Imperial Japanese Army militarily effective on Okinawa is the same strategy that produced the Okinawan civilian catastrophe. Those are not two stories. They are one story with two accounting systems. Both assessments are true. Militarily effective and catastrophic do not exclude one another. And the live analytical question, the one historians have not resolved and probably cannot resolve, is whether a strategy can be called sound when its success condition requires the destruction of the population it is ostensibly defending. Strength figures for the 32nd Army are contested, with estimates running from roughly 76,000 to roughly 120,000. A common breakdown gives approximately 67,000 Imperial Japanese Army regulars, approximately 9,000 Imperial Japanese Navy personnel, and approximately 24,000 Okinawan conscripts and militia. Richard Frank, writing in Naval History in 2016, gives roughly 100,000 total, about 75,000 Japanese, and the rest Okinawans. Notice what that last clause is doing. About 75,000 Japanese, and the rest Okinawans. 25,000 people in the Japanese order of battle at Okinawa were not, in the way the Japanese state itself understood the category, entirely Japanese. Hold that one too. The Battle of Okinawa did not begin on the 1st of April. It began on the 26th of March, 6 days earlier and 15 miles offshore. On the 26th of March, 1945, the 77th Infantry Division landed in the Karamaretto, a cluster of small islands west of Okinawa, with the 3rd Battalion landing team of the 305th Regimental Combat Team going ashore first. Those islands were secured by the 29th of March. Americans wanted the Karamaretto for a sheltered anchorage, since a fleet needs somewhere to repair and rearm, and the Karama Islands offered exactly that. What American troops found there was something else. In the Karamaretto, they discovered Shinyo, Japanese suicide motorboats, small craft packed with explosives and built to be driven into the hull of an Allied ship by a single pilot who would not be coming back. That discovery, 6 days before the main landing, delivered the first hard physical evidence of the scale on which Japan intended to fight this battle. Not a tactic used occasionally by a handful of volunteers, but an industrial category of weapon, prepositioned in numbers, sitting in the boat sheds of an outlying island group, waiting. On the 31st of March, American forces seized the Keys Shima islets in order to emplace 155mm artillery, the guns known as Long Toms, within range of the Okinawan mainland. Then came the bombardment. Across the 7 days before the landing, naval guns fired more than 13,000 large-caliber shells, ranging from 6-inch through 16-inch, counting 5-inch fire alongside the heavier calibers. The total delivered onto ground targets reached 5,162 tons of ammunition. On the morning of the landing itself, the figures escalate into something almost abstract. 44,825 rounds of 5-inch or larger shells, 33,000 rockets, and 22,500 mortar shells, all fired in support of a single morning's landing. Roughly 3,800 tons of shells came down in the first 24 hours, and it stands as the heaviest naval gunfire ever delivered in support of an amphibious landing. All of it accomplished very little, because the Japanese were not there. The 1st of April, 1945, fell on Easter Sunday, and it was also April Fool's Day. American troops going ashore on the Higuchi beaches noticed both. 2nd Marine Division ran a feint at Minatoga on the southeastern coast, drawing Japanese attention away from the real landing, while the main assault came ashore on the west coast. Kadena and Yontan airfields, the two objectives that justified the entire operation, passed into American hands within hours. There was almost no resistance. Ernie Pyle, the most widely read American war correspondent of the conflict, went in with the troops and wrote about a beach with no dead and no wounded on it, describing the carnage that is almost inevitable on an invasion as wonderfully and beautifully not there. Now change vantage point. Move 15 miles south and several hundred feet up to the Japanese observation positions around Shuri. From Shuri, Ushijima watched the United States 10th Army land approximately 16,000 troops in the space of 1 hour. Ushijima had artillery. Ushijima held the high ground, months of preparation, a fortified line, and something in the region of 100,000 men. and Ushijima did not fire. This is where the popular narrative of Okinawa most often goes wrong. That unopposed landing gets presented regularly as an American success, a triumph of deception, of bombardment, of overwhelming force, and it was none of those things. The unopposed landing was the Japanese plan executing exactly as designed. Every American soldier who walked up that beach unharmed on Easter Sunday was walking into a killing ground that had been surveyed, ranged, and fortified for months, and the men who built it were watching him do it. Yahara's design required the Americans to come inland, because a defense in depth only functions if the enemy enters the depth. Contesting the beach would have exposed Japanese artillery to naval counter-battery fire from a fleet of 1,300 ships, and would have achieved nothing except the destruction of the guns Yahara needed later. So the 32nd Army held its fire and let the 10th Army walk in. American troops spent the first days of April moving north and east against light opposition, and a mood took hold in the 10th Army that the campaign might prove easier than anticipated. Reports from the northern part of the island read as encouraging. That mood lasted about a week. Between roughly the 8th and the 14th of April, 1945, the southern advance of the 10th Army ran into the outer defenses of the Shuri Line at a feature called Kakazu Ridge. This was the first heavy fighting of the campaign, and it functioned as a demonstration model of everything Yahara had built. Japanese counterattacks on the nights of the 12th and the 14th of April were repulsed, but the ridge did not fall, the American advance did not resume, and the arithmetic of the campaign quietly reversed itself. 10th Army had spent a week taking most of an island, and would now spend 2 months taking the southern end of it. The Japanese defensive system at Kakazu and along the wider Shuri Line ran on reverse slopes. Guns and infantry sat on the far side of ridgelines, invisible to observers and largely immune to flat trajectory naval gunfire, connected by tunnels so that positions destroyed on one face could be reoccupied from within. American troops taking the crest of a ridge did not take the ridge. American troops taking the crest of a ridge arrived at the beginning of the problem. The architecture deserves stating plainly, because it outlived the battle by 80 years and now describes something entirely different. Defense in depth is today a standard term in information security, meaning the principle that no single perimeter should be load-bearing, that an attacker who breaches one layer should find another layer behind it, and that the defender's advantage comes from forcing the attacker to pay repeatedly for the same ground. Every crest the 10th Army took at Kakazu brought a view of the next crest. The system was built so that success and progress would not be the same thing. On the 16th of April, the 77th Infantry Division assaulted Shima, a small island off the western coast of Okinawa with an airfield on it. On the 18th of April, on Shima, Ernie Pyle was killed by machine gun fire. Pyle had written that report about the empty beach 17 days earlier. Pyle had covered North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy, and had built his reputation on writing about infantrymen rather than generals, the men he called the mud, rain, frost, and wind boys. Pyle came to the Pacific reluctantly and had told friends he did not expect to survive the war. On Shima, that expectation was met. On the 19th of April, the American 24th Corps launched a general offensive against the Shuri Line, preceded by one of the largest artillery preparations of the entire Pacific War. That offensive failed. A tank thrust lost 22 Shermans, and American casualties for the operation ran between roughly 700 and 720. The line did not break. 2.5 weeks after the unopposed landing, 10th Army finally understood what it was actually facing. While the 10th Army was discovering the Shuri Line, the Imperial Japanese Navy did something that has never been satisfactorily explained in purely military terms. On the 6th of April, 1945, Admiral Somu Toyota, commanding the combined fleet, ordered Operation Tenichigo. The battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built and the physical embodiment of Japanese naval ambition, would sortie toward Okinawa accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and a screen of destroyers. The stated intent had Yamato reaching Okinawa, beaching herself on the island, and fighting as an unsinkable shore battery until destroyed. Yamato sailed without air cover, because by April 1945 the Imperial Japanese Navy no longer possessed the carrier. aviation to provide any. On the 7th of April, Task Force 58 found the formation in the East China Sea, and approximately 386 to 390 American aircraft attacked in waves. Yamato went down, Yahagi went down, and between 4 and 5 destroyers went down with them. Japanese dead for the operation are estimated at between roughly 3,000 and 4,240, with the dead aboard Yamato alone given as between roughly 2,498 and 3,063, the range itself reflecting how few survived to be counted. American losses came to approximately 10 aircraft and 12 men. 12 men against 3,000. That exchange ratio is the most efficient in the entire campaign, and it explains nothing about why the operation happened. Tenichi-go makes more sense read as an institutional decision than a military one, and the framework that fits it comes from organizational psychology rather than naval strategy. What the combined fleet exhibited in April 1945 is what behavioral economists call escalation of commitment, the tendency of an institution that has invested enormously in a course of action to continue investing precisely because the prior investment cannot be recovered. Yamato had consumed a staggering share of Japan's steel, industrial capacity, and institutional prestige, and had spent most of the war unable to justify that expenditure. So at the point where the military utility of Yamato had reached zero, the Imperial Japanese Navy spent the ship not to accomplish anything, but because the alternative was allowing the ship to survive the war having accomplished nothing. The same pattern destroys companies that refuse to abandon a failing flagship product and keeps failing infrastructure projects funded past the point of rational continuation. The sunk cost cannot be recovered. Institutions spend anyway, because writing off the investment is an admission the institution cannot make about itself. Across the whole campaign, Japanese naval losses came to 16 ships sunk and 4 damaged, according to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey figures reproduced in the American official history. 16 ships against 1,300. By the 7th of April 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy as a surface force had ceased to matter in the Pacific War. What replaced it was something that could not be sunk, because it was not a fleet. Between late March and June of 1945, the Japanese launched 10 mass suicide air operations against the Allied fleet off Okinawa, designated Kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemum. Kikusui No. 1 began on the 6th and 7th of April, coinciding with the Yamato sortie, when something in the region of 700 to 900 aircraft came at the fleet. The destroyers Bush and Colquhoun were sunk. The scale of the air campaign as a whole resists compression. Naval History and Heritage Command records that 1,840 Japanese sorties over Okinawa were suicide missions, in which 960 participating aircraft were destroyed. Approximately 9,400 aircraft in total headed toward the fleet across the course of the campaign, and not all of those were kamikaze. Other summaries give the number of dedicated kamikaze aircraft as over 1,500. To detect incoming raids far enough out to scramble fighters, the Americans established 15 radar picket stations in a ring around Okinawa. Each station was manned by destroyers and destroyer escorts, stationed alone, far from the massed anti-aircraft protection of the fleet, for the specific purpose of being seen first. That picket line worked exactly as intended, which is to say the ships on it were attacked exactly as intended. Roughly 10 to 13 destroyers and destroyer escorts on picket duty were sunk, and roughly 32 were damaged. Across the campaign, Allied ships sunk numbered between 34, the figure in the report of Fleet Admiral King, and 36. Ships damaged numbered 368, and fleet aircraft lost numbered 763. The casualty profile of the United States Navy at Okinawa looks unlike anything else in the campaign. Naval History and Heritage Command records 4,907 Navy personnel killed and 4,824 wounded. Set those two numbers beside each other. The Navy suffered roughly a 1-to-1 ratio of killed to wounded, where the Marine Corps ratio, at Okinawa, ran roughly 1-to-5. That divergence is not a statistical curiosity. It describes what happens to a human being on a ship. An infantryman hit by fragments has a reasonable prospect of evacuation and survival, while a sailor aboard a destroyer struck by an aircraft carrying a bomb is inside a sealed steel container that is now on fire, and the categories of wounded and killed collapse into each other. The United States Navy lost more men killed at Okinawa than in any other single engagement of the Second World War. The standard framing of the kamikaze is irrationality, fanaticism, a death cult, a nation losing its grip on military logic. That framing satisfies emotionally and fails analytically because the numbers do not support it. Run the exchange as a cost calculation. Japan expended aircraft that were, by 1945, largely obsolete, flown by pilots whose training had been compressed to the point where those pilots could not have survived conventional combat operations against American fighters anyway. Against that expenditure, Japan sank or damaged more than 400 Allied vessels and inflicted the heaviest single-engagement naval death toll of the American War. By the cold metric of cost exchange, resources expended against damage inflicted, the kamikaze campaign at Okinawa ranks among the most efficient operations Japan conducted in the entire Pacific War. It was the only thing Japan was doing in 1945 that was working. That logic did not disappear in 1945. The defining military problem of the 21st century is the same problem: cheap and expendable one-way aerial systems arriving in saturating numbers against extraordinarily expensive naval platforms whose defensive munitions cost orders of magnitude more than the things they are shooting down. Modern navies call it the cost per intercept problem and treat it as a novel crisis of contemporary warfare. It is not novel. It was solved, in reverse, off Okinawa in the spring of 1945, and the solution the Allies found then is the same solution navies reach for now, which is to push the detection perimeter outward, accept losses at the perimeter, and by interception time with the lives of whoever is standing furthest forward. The radar picket destroyer is the direct ancestor of every early warning sacrifice in modern layered defense. What the men aboard those ships were doing has a name in systems architecture now, and it did not have one then. There is an engineering story buried inside the kamikaze campaign worth pulling out, because it settled a design argument that had been running for a decade. The British Pacific Fleet operated off Okinawa as Task Force 57, under Admiral Rawlings, with the carriers Illustrious, Indomitable, Victorious, Formidable, Indefatigable, and Implacable. British fleet carriers had been built to a different philosophy from American ones, because British carriers had armored flight decks. That choice carried real penalties. Armor means weight. Weight sits high in a carrier's structure, and the consequence was that British carriers embarked considerably smaller air groups than their American counterparts. Through most of the war, this looked like a straightforward disadvantage, since fewer aircraft is fewer aircraft. Then the kamikaze arrived, and the calculation inverted overnight. An aircraft striking an American wooden flight deck penetrated it. An aircraft striking a British armored flight deck did not. On the 1st of April, the day of the landing, Indefatigable took a kamikaze hit and was operational again within an hour. On the 4th of May, a kamikaze struck Indomitable and, in the phrasing that survives in the accounts, simply slid along the flight deck and went over the side. Across the entire campaign, British Pacific Fleet losses came to about 20 sailors killed. Admiral Raymond Spruance specifically requested that the British carriers strike the airfields on Formosa between the 8th and 11th of April, on the reasoning that the British ships were less vulnerable to the weapon now defining the campaign. What happened to the armored deck debate at Okinawa is the clearest illustration in military history of a principle that governs modern engineering across every field. A design trade-off is not correct or incorrect in the abstract. A design trade-off is correct or incorrect relative to a threat model, and threat models change without warning. British naval architects had armored their flight decks in the 1930s on the assumption of operations in confined European waters within range of land-based bombers. That was the threat model, and the threat model was wrong for the Pacific for 3 years, since the reduced air group handicapped them genuinely in the carrier battles of 1942 through 1944. Then, in the space of a single spring, an entirely unanticipated weapon appeared and revealed the armored deck as the correct answer to a question nobody had asked when the ships were designed. The same phenomenon plays out in modern systems engineering when a redundancy that looked like expensive over-provisioning suddenly becomes the only reason a system survives a failure mode nobody modeled. Engineers who make those decisions are almost never vindicated for the reason they thought they would be. British carrier designers were right about armor, and British carrier designers were right for reasons that had nothing to do with why they chose it. By late April 1945, 10th Army was locked into a frontal assault on the Shuri Line, and inside the American command a serious argument had broken out about whether that was the right thing to do. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. commanded the 10th Army. The proposal put to Buckner, pushed by senior Marine officers, by Major General Andrew Bruce of the 77th Division, and by the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Vandegrift, was an amphibious end run. Instead of grinding frontally into the strongest fortifications in the Pacific, land a force behind them, at Minnetonka on the southeastern coast, and take the Shuri Line from the rear. Buckner rejected it, and 10th Army continued forward. Criticism of that decision began during the battle and has never really stopped. American losses at Okinawa were, in the words of the record, so heavy as to elicit congressional calls for an investigation into the conduct of the military commanders. That is an extraordinary sentence about a campaign the United States won. Those frontal assaults acquired a name among the troops who conducted them, and the name was the meat grinder. The easy version of this story has Buckner as a conventional soldier who lacked imagination and got men killed for it, and the easy version deserves more scrutiny than it usually gets, because the people who agreed with Buckner were not fools and their objections were specific. Admiral Nimitz concurred with Buckner's decision, and so did Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman. The Navy's own planner, Captain A. E. Becker, examined the Minnetonka beaches and judged them unsuitable, since the approaches were backed by high cliffs, which is precisely the terrain feature that turns an amphibious landing into a trap. And the supply line supporting the 10th Army was already strained. Return to the throughput problem from earlier in this story, because that is where it becomes a command decision rather than a logistics footnote. An amphibious landing at Minnetonka would not have been an addition to the existing American supply effort. An amphibious landing at Minnetonka would have been a second and entirely separate supply effort, over worse beaches, sustaining a force that would sit isolated behind the strongest Japanese positions on the island if the landing failed to link up. The Allied experience at Anzio in Italy, a landing behind enemy lines that achieved surprise and then sat immobilized for months while the force ashore was slowly bled, was 14 months old and fresh in every senior planner's memory. The honest formulation of the Buckner controversy is not that Buckner chose the bloody option over the clever one. The honest formulation is that Buckner chose a certainly bloody option over an option that was possibly less bloody and possibly catastrophic, on the advice of naval officers who had examined the ground and did not like it. Whether that was the right call remains genuinely unresolved, and it should stay unresolved. What can be said is that the cost of the option Buckner chose is precisely quantified, while the cost of the option Buckner rejected is unknowable, which is a structural asymmetry that makes every retrospective judgment of this decision harder than it looks. The road taken has a casualty list. The road not taken does not. On the night of the 4th of May, 1945, the Japanese 32nd Army abandoned the strategy that was working and attacked. Within roughly 36 hours, that decision had destroyed the capacity of the 32nd Army to prolong the battle, and Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, the officer who had pushed hardest for the attack, privately concluded that only time now intervened between defeat and the 32nd Army. The counteroffensive jumped off on the night of the 3rd to the 4th of May and made its main effort on the 4th and 5th. It was decisively defeated with heavy losses. Ushijima reverted immediately afterward to pure defense and never attempted another offensive operation. The verdict of the American official history on that operation is unusually blunt for an official history, calling the counteroffensive a colossal blunder, overambitiously conceived and ineptly executed. The interesting question about the 4th of May is not whether the attack failed. The interesting question is why an army with a functioning strategy abandoned it. 32nd Army held two competing philosophies inside its own headquarters, embodied in two officers. Colonel Hiramichi Yahara served as operations officer and architect of attrition, and Yahara's position held that the only asset the 32nd Army possessed was time, that every offensive action spent irreplaceable troops to purchase ground that could not be held, and that the correct course was to remain in the caves and make the Americans come. Lieutenant General Osamu Cho served as chief of staff, and Cho came from a very different tradition, having previously served as chief of staff of the 10th Army in China. Cho was aggressive by temperament and by doctrine, and Cho found the attritional defense intolerable, not because Cho could refute the arithmetic, but because sitting in a cave while an enemy advance defended everything Cho understood an army to be for. Cho won the argument, and Yahara, who opposed the counteroffensive, was overruled. What happened inside the 32nd Army headquarters in early May 1945 is a textbook case of a pattern organizational researchers now document across corporate and institutional settings. Under sustained pressure, institutions abandon strategies that are working slowly in favor of actions that feel decisive. The pressure does not have to be rational to work. A strategy of deliberate passivity is psychologically almost impossible for an institution to sustain when the identity of that institution is built around action, because passivity reads internally as failure regardless of what the outcome data says. This is why turnaround executives bet the company on dramatic pivots, when incremental strategies were already succeeding. Since the incremental strategy provides no visible evidence of leadership, and leadership under scrutiny demands visible evidence. Cho did not attack on the 4th of May because Cho expected to win. Cho attacked because remaining underground had become institutionally unbearable. The aftermath inside the Japanese headquarters survives in Yahara's own account. After the counteroffensive collapsed, Ushijima wept, and Ushijima promised Yahara that from that point onward, he would follow Yahara's counsel. Ushijima kept the promise, and it no longer mattered. The troops the 32nd Army had spent on the 4th and 5th of May were the troops that would have held the line through June, and Cho's own assessment, that only time now intervened between defeat and the 32nd Army, proved correct. The single best executed Japanese defensive campaign of the Pacific War was broken from the inside, by its own headquarters, in 36 hours. The Japanese counteroffensive failed, the American advance resumed, and the resumption was not a breakthrough. It was the meat grinder again, and in the middle of May it produced the single most concentrated killing ground of the campaign. Sugarloaf Hill was a small feature on the western end of the Shuri Line, a low rise that in isolation looked unimposing. Sugarloaf formed part of a mutually supporting complex, covered by fire from adjacent hills, and it stood between the 6th Marine Division and the city of Naha. 6th Marine Division opened the assault on the 14th of May. Between the 12th and the 18th of May, American forces at Sugarloaf lost 2,662 men killed or seriously wounded. In the same period and in the same place, American forces recorded 1,289 cases of combat fatigue. Set those two figures beside each other. 2,662 physically destroyed and 1,289 psychologically destroyed in 6 days, on one hill. The hill was secured around the 18th of May. That combat fatigue figure at Sugarloaf is no anomaly within the campaign, and functions instead as a sample of a pattern running through the whole of Okinawa. Across the campaign, 10th Army recorded more than 26,000 non-battle casualties. The combat stress rate at Okinawa ran at approximately 48% of the combat wound rate, meaning that for every 100 men wounded by enemy fire, roughly 48 more were removed from the line by psychiatric causes. For comparison, the equivalent figure in the Korean War ran at roughly 20 to 25%. Okinawa produced psychiatric casualties at roughly double the rate of the next major American ground war. The reason is structural, and it follows directly from everything Yahara designed. Combat stress casualties correlate less with intensity of violence than with three specific conditions, which are duration of exposure, absence of any prospect of relief, and the perception that individual action does not affect outcome. Yahara's defensive system maximized all three simultaneously and by design. There was no rear area on Okinawa. The island was too small, The front ran continuously across its width, and Japanese artillery reached everywhere the 10th Army could go. There was no rotation out, because the campaign lasted 82 days, and there was nowhere to rotate to. The defense in depth ensured that the crest taken today revealed the crest that would have to be taken tomorrow, indefinitely, so that the relationship between effort and progress became invisible to the men making the effort. Add the rain. The Shuri line collapsed into liquid mud in late May, and men fought and slept and were wounded in it, alongside the unrecovered dead of both armies. Yahara had designed a system to inflict cost. That system inflicted a category of cost Yahara had not specifically engineered for, and inflicted it at double the rate of the war that followed. On the 29th of May, 1945, the 1st Marine Division took Shuri Castle. Shuri Castle had been the royal seat of the Ryukyu Kingdom, the political and ceremonial center of the independent polity Japan abolished in 1879. By 1945, Shuri Castle sat directly atop the Japanese command tunnels and anchored the entire Japanese defensive line. The building was destroyed. Taking Shuri should have ended the battle, since Shuri was the keystone of the position held by the 32nd Army, and its fall meant the fortified belt had been penetrated. The battle did not end, because between roughly the 29th and 31st of May, the 32nd Army withdrew. Under heavy rain that grounded American aircraft and turned the ground into an impassable slurry, Ushijima extracted the surviving core of the 32nd Army from the Shuri position and moved it south to a final defensive line in the island's southernmost hills. The American 24th Corps issued Field Order No. 52 on the 31st of May as the situation became clear. Purely as a military operation, that withdrawal was a considerable achievement. Disengaging an army from close contact with a superior enemy ranks among the most difficult maneuvers in ground warfare, and the 32nd Army did it in the rain, at night, under an air force that would have annihilated the columns had the weather permitted flying. Here the two accounting systems of this battle collide directly, because the withdrawal that preserved the 32nd Army as a fighting force is the single decision that produced the largest share of the Okinawans' civilian death toll. The southern tip of Okinawa in late May 1945 was not empty. It was where the civilian population had gone. Tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians had been pushed steadily southward ahead of the fighting throughout April and May, until they were concentrated in the last unoccupied portion of the island, the same ground into which Ushijima now moved his army, and the same ground onto which the full weight of American naval gunfire, artillery, and air power would now be directed. Consider the tonnage about to arrive there. Across the campaign, naval gunfire alone accounted for approximately 300,000 rounds of 5-inch and larger, according to Naval History and Heritage Command, or approximately 600,000 rounds counting all naval fires, per the National World War II Museum, and those two figures differ by definition rather than contradiction. Ground artillery of the 10th Army fired approximately 1.1 million 105mm howitzer rounds, while aggregate estimates for all Allied artillery shells fired between the 24th of March and the 22nd of June run to approximately 2.4 million. A meaningful share of that total landed on the southern quarter of Okinawa in June 1945, into terrain containing an army that had chosen to fight there and a civilian population with nowhere else to be. The typhoon of steel is not a metaphor invented by historians. Tetsu no bofu, meaning violent wind of steel, is the phrase Okinawans used for what happened to them, alongside Tetsu no aim, rain of steel. The popularization of that phrase is associated with the post-war Okinawan documentary compilation Tetsu no Bofu, published by the Okinawa Times in 1950, and the precise originator is not firmly established in the English-language sources. This is the part of the Battle of Okinawa the operational histories handle least well, and it is the part Japan is still litigating. Start with the students. On the 23rd of March, 1945, 3 days before the first American landing in the Karamoreto, 222 students and 18 teachers from the 1st Okinawa Girls High School and the Okinawa Women's Normal School were mobilized as Army nurses. The unit is remembered as the Himuri Student Corps. Himuri students were assigned to the cave hospital system of the Japanese Army, underground facilities of which the Hybru Army Field Hospital ranked among the largest, where surgery was performed by lamplight in tunnels cut into limestone, without adequate anesthetic, sanitation, or supply. Teenage girls carried out amputated limbs and handled the dead. In June, as the Japanese position collapsed, the army issued a dissolution order and dispersed the student units, releasing girls and their teens into open ground in the middle of the heaviest bombardment of the Pacific War, with no protection, no organization, and nowhere to go. That dissolution order produced the single largest concentration of Himyuri deaths, at the position remembered as the Third Surgical Cave. Of the conscripted Himyuri members, 136 died. Counting the wider school population of around 300, 211 students and 16 teachers were killed in total. The boys were conscripted as well. Approximately 1,780 schoolboys aged 14 to 17 were mobilized into the Taketsu Kinatai, the Iron and Blood Imperial Corps, and put into frontline service, where roughly half were killed. Younger boys served in the Signal Corps. Across all 21 secondary schools on Okinawa, 2,049 conscripted students and teachers were killed. Here is the detail almost always omitted, and it is the one that matters most. Conscripting these children had no basis in Japanese law. No legal mechanism existed in the Japanese statutory framework permitting the military conscription of 14-year-olds. The mobilization was carried out by Army Ministry Ordinance, and in some cases the supporting documents were counterfeited. The Japanese Army on Okinawa did not conscript children under a wartime emergency law. The Japanese Army on Okinawa conscripted children by manufacturing the paperwork. Set that beside the adults. Okinawan men were drafted into the Beitaitai, the Home Guard, in numbers estimated at between roughly 17,000 and 24,000, alongside approximately 15,000 non-uniformed laborers. Aggregate figures for Ryukyuans drafted into Japanese service across all categories run to approximately 39,000. Okinawans were not the only colonial subjects on the island. Korean forced laborers were present on Okinawa, as were Korean women held in the Japanese military system of sexual slavery, and Taiwanese colonial subjects were present as well. The cornerstone of Peace Memorial, which we will come to, records the dead of every one of these categories separately, and the act of recording them separately amounted to a deliberate statement. Then there is the category the Japanese language calls shunjiketsu, meaning group suicide, in which Okinawan scholarship increasingly refers to as compulsory group death, on the grounds that the word suicide implies a choice that was frequently not present. Okinawan civilians died in mass killings within their own families and communities. Grenades were distributed. Whether, and how directly, the Japanese military ordered these deaths is the question that has been fought over in Japanese courts and Japanese textbook screening committees for decades, and we will return to it, because that fight is not history. It is a live dispute with a court ruling in 2008. Alongside the mass deaths, Okinawan civilians were killed directly by Japanese soldiers on suspicion of spying, a suspicion that attached with particular force to Okinawans overheard speaking the Ryukyuan language the Japanese state had spent 6 decades trying to eradicate. Civilians were also expelled from caves by Japanese troops who wanted the shelter into bombardment. And the reason the civilian death toll from Okinawa cannot be stated as a single number is that these deaths occurred in categories different record keepers count differently, and those counting decisions were, and remain, political. Rear Admiral Minoru Oda commanded the naval base force of the Imperial Japanese Navy on the Oriku Peninsula, near Naha, with roughly 10,000 men, of whom roughly half were recently conscripted laborers rather than trained naval personnel. By early June 1945, Oda's position was surrounded and his command was being destroyed. On the 6th of June, Oda sent a telegram to Naval Headquarters, and a separate farewell telegram to 32nd Army Headquarters followed at 1600 hours on the 12th of June. That 6th of June telegram is a document unlike anything else produced by a Japanese commander in the Pacific War, and it is preserved at the site of the underground naval headquarters where Oda wrote it. Oda did not use his final dispatch to report on the tactical situation, or to affirm loyalty to the emperor, or to describe the honorable death of his command. Oda used the telegram to describe what the Okinawan civilian population had endured: the conscription of Okinawan men, the mobilization of Okinawan women into military service, the destruction of Okinawan homes and food supplies, and the conduct of civilians who continued to support Japanese forces while being annihilated. Oda closed by asking Tokyo to give the Okinawan people special consideration from this day forward. Understand what that request implies about the sender. A serving Japanese flag officer, writing his final message with his command being destroyed around him, concluded that the treatment of the Okinawan population required a specific plea to the central government, because Oda evidently did not expect the central government would extend that consideration on its own. Oda was not making a rhetorical gesture. Oda was making a prediction about how the Japanese state would treat Okinawa after the war, and Oda was worried enough about that prediction to spend his last official communication on it. The English wording of the telegram varies between translations, and the document itself stands as a verified primary source. On the 13th of June, 1945, Rear Admiral Minoru Oda committed suicide in the underground naval headquarters on the Oriku Peninsula. Oda was posthumously promoted to Vice Admiral. Oda's telegram now sits at the center of how Okinawa remembers the battle, as the one contemporaneous document from inside the Japanese command structure that treats the Okinawan civilian population as the subject of the story rather than as terrain. The final phase of the Battle of Okinawa was fought in the southern hills between roughly the 11th and the 17th of June, 1945, with the American official history dating the decisive plateau fighting to the 13th through 17th of June. The place name that attached to it was Kanishi Ridge. By the middle of June, the outcome was not in question. What remained was the process of clearing an army out of caves it would not leave. On the 18th of June, 1945, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. went forward to an 8th Marines observation post near the southwestern tip of the island to watch his troops in action. Japanese artillery fired on the position. The shell did not strike Buckner directly. The blast knocked loose a fragment of coral, and that coral fragment struck Buckner in the chest. Buckner collapsed at 13:15 hours and died approximately 10 minutes later. There is a widely circulated story about Buckner's last words, and it should be handled carefully because the primary record does not support it. The United States Army official history records no last words. Appleman's account states that Buckner collapsed immediately and died 10 minutes later, and nothing more. A family recollection, given by Buckner's son in 2024, describes Buckner asking whether anyone else had been hurt and, on being told no, smiling. That account is secondhand and was given roughly 79 years after the event, which makes it something other than a verbatim quotation, and it should not be presented as one. What Buckner is documented as having said comes 3 days earlier. On the 15th of June, 1945, Buckner stated that the campaign had passed the speculative phase and was down to the final kill. That is a verified primary source quotation from the American official history, and it is not a last word. It is the assessment of a commander who believed he had 3 days of routine mopping up ahead of him, and who was right about the battle and wrong about himself. Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. was the highest-ranking United States officer killed by enemy fire in the Second World War and was posthumously promoted to 4-star general by an act of Congress in 1954. Command of the 10th Army passed immediately to Major General Roy S. Geiger of the United States Marine Corps. That succession is a genuine anomaly in American military history, and it gets routinely passed over. Geiger commanded the 3rd Amphibious Corps, and on Buckner's death Geiger assumed command of an entire numbered United States field army in combat. Roy Geiger is the only Marine ever to do so. On the 19th of June, Brigadier General Claudius M. Easley was killed by machine gun fire. 10th Army lost its commanding general and a general officer on consecutive days, at the point where the campaign had already been decided. Organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa ended between the 21st and 22nd of June, 1945. Hill 81, the last organized pocket, fell on the 21st. At 1000 hours on the 22nd of June, the American command formally declared the end of organized resistance, and a flag was raised. Lieutenant General Mitsu Ushijima and Lieutenant General Isamu Cho committed seppuku at Mabuni Hill, also known as Hill 89, on the 22nd of June, in the closing hours of the battle. A small number of accounts placed the deaths on the night of the 21st into the 22nd. Both officers left death poems. Ushijima's is rendered in the United States Marine Corps official history as a verse about the green grass of the island withering untimely before autumn and growing again in the warm spring of the empire. Cho's, inscribed on a kimono, concerns the offering of one's life to fulfill duty toward emperor and country. Both texts should be treated as widely reported rather than verified, since both survive in translations that differ materially from one another, and the wording in circulation is reconstructed. There is also a well-known exchange at the cave mouth, in which Cho is quoted telling Ushijima that as the way may be dark, Cho will lead the way. That account appears in the Marine Corps official history, and it is directly contradicted by other accounts stating that Ushijima insisted on going first. That contradiction is not a minor discrepancy. It is a symptom of something that ought to change how this entire campaign is read from the Japanese side. Before the end, Ushijima gave Colonel Hiramichi Yahara an order. Yahara was not to die. Yahara was to attempt to escape, to survive, and to tell what had happened. The instruction as it is transmitted runs that if Yahara died, there would be no one left who knew the truth about the Battle of Okinawa, and Yahara was to bear the temporary shame but endure it as an order from his army commander. Yahara obeyed, and Yahara was captured. Yahara survived the war and wrote a memoir, The Battle for Okinawa. Yahara was also the sole surviving senior staff officer of the 32nd Army. Consider what that means for everything you have just heard about the Japanese conduct of this battle. The strategic reasoning behind abandoning beach defense. The internal argument between attrition and offensive action. The pressure Cho applied before the 4th of May. Ushijima weeping after the counteroffensive failed and promising to follow Yahara's counsel thereafter. The order to Yahara to live. Almost all of it reaches us through one man, and that man is the man whose strategic judgment the account consistently vindicates, whose opponent in the central internal dispute is portrayed as having destroyed the army by overruling him, and who is under a direct order from his commanding general to be the one who told the story. None of this means Yahara lied. Yahara's account is corroborated at many points by American operational records, and Yahara's version of the 4th of May is consistent with what the 32nd Army was observably able to do afterward. Yahara's memoir is indispensable, and there is no substitute for it, but it remains a single-source account produced by an interested party operating under instruction, and the quotation about the exchange at the cave mouth, where the official histories cannot agree on which general went first, serves as a useful reminder of how thin the evidentiary layer under the Japanese side of this battle actually is. The truth about the Battle of Okinawa, in Ushijima's phrasing, was to be preserved by a survivor. It largely was, and it was also, unavoidably, shaped by him. The Battle of Okinawa ended on the 22nd of June, 1945. General Joseph Stilwell succeeded Roy Geiger as 10th Army Commander on the 23rd of June, and the formal surrender of Japanese forces in the Ryukyus took place at 10th Army Headquarters on Okinawa on the 7th of September, 1945, with Stilwell officiating. Then the counting began, and it has never finished. Start with the figures that hold relatively firm. American killed and missing came to more than 12,000, comprising nearly 5,000 Navy dead and almost 8,000 Marine and Army dead. American wounded numbered approximately 36,000 to 38,000, and total American casualties approximately 49,000 to 50,000. Japanese military dead are already less certain, with estimates running from approximately 66,000 to over 110,000. The American count gives 107,539 soldiers killed, plus an estimated 23,764 sealed in caves or buried, a category which by definition was never verified by counting bodies. Aggregate compilations give total Japanese casualties in a band from 84,166 to 117,000, while the Himuri Peace Museum's breakdown attributes approximately 65,000 of the dead to mainland Japanese troops specifically. Then there are the Okinawan civilians, and here the numbers stop behaving like numbers. The United States Army official history lineage gives approximately 42,000 civilians killed by artillery fire and bombing, the figure the Marine veteran and memoirist E.B. Sledge reproduced, reflecting American Army estimates. The Okinawa prefectural government gives approximately 94,000, a figure cited in Ian Toll's Twilight of the Gods. Local Okinawan authorities record that at least 149,425 Okinawan people were killed, died by coerced suicide, or went missing. The Himuri Peace Museum gives 188,136 total dead in the battle, of whom approximately 150,000 were Okinawan, 42,000 at one end, 150,000 at the other. The high estimate exceeds the low estimate by more than 3.5 times for the same event, in the same place, over the same 82 days. That spread is not primarily a failure of record-keeping. That spread follows from definitional choices, and it works the same way definitional choices work in any contested statistic in modern public life. Consider how national unemployment figures function. Two governments can measure the same labor market and report figures differing by a factor of 2, without either committing fraud, because the reported number depends entirely on prior definitional decisions, meaning whether discouraged workers who stopped looking are counted, whether underemployment counts, and what the reference period is. The definitions are chosen before the counting starts, and the definitions determine the answer. The Okinawan civilian death toll works identically. The low American figure counts civilians killed by artillery fire and bombing, meaning deaths directly attributable to American ordnance. That definition is defensible, and it excludes an enormous amount. It excludes deaths from starvation and disease during the collapse. It excludes civilians killed by Japanese troops as suspected spies. It excludes Shunjiketsu deaths. It excludes civilians expelled from shelter, and it excludes the missing. The high Okinawan figures count all of it: killed, died by coerced suicide, or went missing, as the prefectural formulation puts it. Neither figure is a lie. They are answers to different questions, and the choice of which question to ask is where the politics lives. An accounting that counts only deaths caused by American ordnance produces a battle in which the Japanese army did not kill Okinawans. An accounting that counts coerced suicide produces a battle in which the Japanese army did. This is why the number cannot be settled by finding better records. The number sits downstream of an argument about responsibility, and that argument is still running. One figure from the battle points in an unexpected direction and deserves flagging, because it contradicts one of the most durable cliches about the Pacific War. Approximately 10,000 Japanese personnel surrendered on Okinawa, which was the highest number of Japanese prisoners taken in any Pacific battle to that point in the war, assisted by American surrender leaflet campaigns. The proposition that Japanese forces never surrendered is not accurate, and Okinawa is where it broke down. In the final weeks, a large number of men in the 32nd Army, many of them Okinawan conscripts and laborers rather than mainland regulars, chose capture. Whatever the 32nd Army was by June 1945, it was not a monolith of men uniformly determined to die. There is a sentence about Okinawa that appears in a great many accounts, and it goes approximately like this. The cost of the Battle of Okinawa convinced American decision-makers that invading Japan would be unacceptable, and that conviction led to the use of atomic weapons. That proposition gets stated frequently and confidently. The framing used by the National World War II Museum has Okinawa leading directly to the decision to use those weapons, while other institutional accounts hold that the cost of the battle weighed heavily in the decision. The proposition is also genuinely contested at the level of professional scholarship, and this is the point in the story where holding the argument open matters more than resolving it. The traditionalist position is most fully developed in Richard B. Frank's Downfall, published in 1999, and finds support in the work of Sadao Asada. On this reading, Okinawa functioned as an empirical data point of enormous weight, demonstrating the casualty rates a defended Japanese position produced, demonstrating the mass kamikaze response, and demonstrating the participation of a civilian population in the defense. Project those observations onto Kyushu and Honshu, and the projections turn intolerable. Okinawa, on this view, shaped the casualty estimates that shaped the decision. The revisionist position is most forcefully argued in Tsuyoshi Hasegawa's Racing the Enemy, published in 2005. Hasegawa contends that the decisive factor in Japan's surrender was not the atomic bombings, but the Soviet declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria on the 8th and 9th of August. Hasegawa further argues that Truman and Burns shaped the wording of the Potsdam Declaration in a manner calculated to ensure Japanese rejection, and Hasegawa, a native Japanese speaker, claims deeper access to the Japanese language sources than his American counterparts. The exchange between Frank and Hasegawa in the H. Diplo Roundtable stands as the central scholarly confrontation on this question, where Frank attacks Hasegawa's reliance on the claims of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey to complete knowledge of the Japanese decision. A third position, associated with Barton Bernstein, declines both. Bernstein challenges the claim that Japan was ready to surrender before Hiroshima, and simultaneously challenges the inflated lives saved figures attached retroactively to the decision. Bernstein's contribution amounts to a caution against retrospective causal certainty in either direction. Here is the formulation the evidence best supports, and it sits uncomfortably beside the popular version. The explicit causal chain from Okinawa to the atomic bomb is far more prominent in post-war justification than in the contemporaneous decision-making record. It is a chain assembled, articulated, and deployed largely after the fact, by people explaining a decision that had already been made to an audience that needed the decision explained. That does not make the chain false. Okinawa's casualty figures were real, the projections drawn from them were real, and the men making decisions in the summer of 1945 had those figures in front of them. What it means is that the confident sentence, "Okinawa led directly to the bomb," does more work than the documentary record authorizes, and the confidence is a retrospective artifact. A related framing runs through much of the literature, asking whether Okinawa was a rehearsal for the invasion of Japan or a deterrent against it. Both readings are defensible, and they do not exclude one another. Okinawa was planned as a rehearsal, the staging base for Operation Downfall, and the proving ground for the assault doctrine that would be used at Kyushu. Okinawa also functioned, at least in part, as a deterrent, the demonstration that made Downfall's projected cost concrete rather than theoretical, which is to say that Yahara's strategy achieved precisely what Yahara designed it to achieve. Jikuzen was never about winning at Okinawa. Jikuzen was about making the price of Okinawa legible in Washington. The price was paid in full, and the price was legible. The response it produced was not the negotiated settlement Japanese planners hoped for. The response was Hiroshima. That is the darkest irony available in this entire campaign, and it should be stated without resolving it. The most intelligently designed Japanese operation of the Pacific War may have succeeded exactly as intended, and in succeeding, contributed to an outcome incomparably worse than the one it was designed to prevent. The operative words there are may have, because the causal chain remains contested, and honest history leaves it contested. The Battle of Okinawa ended in 1945. The argument about the Battle of Okinawa was in a Japanese courtroom in 2008. Okinawa did not return to Japanese administration when the war ended, and was administered directly by the United States for 27 years. Reversion to Japan took place on the 15th of May, 1972. The battle acquired an official day of remembrance. Irii no Hai, meaning Memorial Day, falls on the 23rd of June, marking the end of organized resistance. The government of the Ryukyu Islands made it a holiday in 1961, the holiday lapsed at reversion in 1972, and the prefecture restored it in 1991. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary, Okinawa built a memorial unlike almost any other war memorial in the world. The cornerstone of peace, in Japanese Heiwa no Ishiji, was unveiled at Mabuni, in Itoman, on the 23rd of June 1995, under Governor Masahide Oda, himself an Okinawan scholar of the battle. The memorial inscribes the names of every person who died in the Battle of Okinawa, regardless of nationality and regardless of whether the person was a combatant. Every one of those names is listed, chronologically rather than by allegiance. An early tally of the memorial's inscriptions recorded 148,289 Okinawans, 75,219 mainland Japanese, 14,006 Americans, 82 British, 28 Taiwanese, 82 North Koreans, and 263 South Koreans. The memorial is still growing. As of the June 2025 update, the total reached 242,567 names, following the addition of 342 names announced on the 27th of May, 2025. Names are still being added 80 years later because remains are still being recovered from the ground. Unexploded ordnance from 1945 is still being cleared from Okinawan soil. The battle is not a closed historical event on Okinawa in the way it is elsewhere, and functions instead as an ongoing recovery operation. Inscribing American, British, Taiwanese, and Korean names alongside Japanese and Okinawan ones was a deliberate statement, and it was a statement aimed at least partly inward, at a Japanese national memory, with a persistent tendency to fold Okinawa's experience into a general narrative of national wartime suffering, which is a way of not looking at it. Japan and Okinawa have been arguing about how to look at it for decades. The dispute runs through the Japanese textbook screening system, and it has a long lineage in the litigation associated with the historian Ienaga Saburo, who spent decades in court over the screening of war content in school textbooks. In March 2007, the Japanese Ministry of Education announced that all references to military coercion in the compulsory mass suicides of Okinawan residents during the Battle of Okinawa were to be eliminated from school textbooks. The description belongs to Aniya Masaaki, writing in the Asia-Pacific Journal. The measure affected 7 textbooks from 5 publishers, and the stated reasoning was that a military suicide order cannot be verified. Okinawa's response was the largest demonstration the prefecture had produced since reversion. On the 29th of September, 2007, a rally was held at Jinowan. Okinawan organizers and the prefecture put attendance at approximately 110,000 people, while some Okinawan tallies give 117,000. It exceeded the previous benchmark of Okinawan mass protest, a 1995 rally that had drawn approximately 85,000. Then the question went to court in a libel case. The novelist O.E. Kenzaburo had written about the Okinawan mass deaths in Okinawa Notes, published in 1970. The family of a former Japanese commander, along with a former major named Umezawa, sued O.E. and the publisher Iwanami over Okinawa Notes and over Ienaga's The Pacific War. On the 20th of March, 2008, the Osaka District Court dismissed the suit. Chief Justice Fukami Toshimasa ruled that the former Japanese military was deeply involved in the mass suicides and rejected the plaintiff's testimony as lacking credibility. O.E.'s response held that the verdict indisputably confirmed the deep involvement of the Japanese military. The verdict was upheld on appeal. That is, a Japanese court, in the 21st century, issuing a finding of fact about the conduct of the Japanese army on Okinawa in 1945, because 63 years after the battle, the question of whether the Japanese army bore responsibility for the deaths of Okinawan civilians remained unsettled enough to require adjudication. One further piece of context sits underneath all of it. Okinawa continues to host over 70% of United States military installations in Japan, on a prefecture comprising approximately 0.6% of Japan's land area. That distribution is a legacy of 1945 and of the 27 years of direct administration that followed, and it is the reason the battle has never become purely historical on Okinawa. The island's relationship to the war is not commemorative. It is structural, and it is visible from the road. Return to the beach. The 1st of April, 1945. 182,821 American assault troops coming ashore on the Higuchi beaches against almost no resistance. Ernie Pyle writing about carnage that was wonderfully and beautifully not there, 17 days before Ernie Pyle was killed on Aishima. Mitsuru Ushijima watching 16,000 men land in an hour and giving no order to fire. Everything that followed had already been decided by then. Not the outcome, since the outcome had been decided in Tokyo the previous autumn, when Imperial General Headquarters guessed Taiwan and took away the 9th Division. What was decided on that quiet beach was the shape of the thing, that the battle would be fought slowly, in the south, on ground where the people lived. Hiromichi Yahara built a system designed to convert time into cost, and the system worked. It worked well enough that American institutional assessments, 80 years later, still describe it as the most militarily effective performance the Imperial Japanese Army managed in the Pacific War. That system also required the last stand to be made in the middle of a civilian population, and it produced a death toll 4 different institutions count 4 different ways, ranging from 42,000 to 150,000, because the counting was never really about arithmetic. Isamu Cho could not bear the system and broke it in 36 hours on the 4th of May, then concluded correctly that only time now intervened between defeat and the 32nd Army. Minoru Oda spent his final official communication asking Tokyo to remember what Okinawans had endured, which tells you what Oda expected Tokyo to do otherwise. Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. said on the 15th of June that the campaign was down to the final kill, and was killed 3 days later by a fragment of the island's own coral. Mitsuru Ushijima ordered Hiromichi Yahara to survive so that someone would know the truth about the Battle of Okinawa, and then died at Mabuni on the 22nd of June, leaving the entire Japanese account of the battle in the hands of one officer whose judgment that account consistently vindicates. 242,567 names are now inscribed at Mabuni, on a memorial listing Americans and Britons and Taiwanese and Koreans alongside Okinawans and mainland Japanese, in chronological order, because the people who built it decided that sorting the dead by which side they had been on was not a distinction the memorial should make. 342 of those names were added in 2025. There will be more, because remains are still coming out of the ground. An ordinance from 1945 is still being cleared from soil that people farm. The Battle of Okinawa gets filed as the last great battle before the atomic bombs, the final rehearsal for an invasion that did not happen, the 82 days that made downfall unthinkable. That framing is not wrong. It is just the framing of everyone except the people it happened to. For Okinawa, the battle is not the end of the war. The battle is the point at which a prefecture that had been a kingdom 66 years earlier discovered exactly what its position in the Japanese Empire was worth, and the argument about what that discovery meant has been running in Japanese courts, Japanese classrooms, and Okinawan streets ever since, without arriving anywhere final. Yahara's strategy rested on the premise that the cost of Okinawa would teach the enemy something. The cost was paid in full. Whether the lesson landed where it was aimed, or somewhere else entirely, is a question the numbers have never been able to settle, and the numbers themselves are still being counted.